Thank you, Brian, very much. And, thank you, Ted, and thank you, Wolfgang. I really appreciated the invitation to come and join you and chat a bit. I very much am encouraged by the enthusiasm and despair that I hear. Because both enthusiasm and despair are both aspects of the kind of cycles of interaction we see, both in ecological systems and social and political systems. I think we're at the moment now in our social system teetering on the edge of the famous word of Schumpeter's creative destruction. And that phrase, those two words, capture essentially the points I want to bring up today. It's a time that is destruction, moving, existing, but it's also a time of great creativity, in that as much as accumulated knowledge has the potential for moving into a different direction. What I'm going to do in this half hour is four things. First of all, I'm going to give a very, very quick history of the key elements that I find important and that I find fun to deal with, rooted in the history of the development of the resilience idea. I then want to spend a few moments talking about time and space scale, because the world we've seen unrolling over the last, multiple centuries, but effectively since the war, Second World War, has been a gradually expanding and lurching expansion of both our sense of time and the way elements nest together and our sense of scale and space. I want to spend a little time on that. Then I'd like to shift to talking about the turbulence that we're facing right now. I want to deal with that in a very general kind of way, emphasizing the point that there is high degrees of uncertainty. We know that. But more important, there's a high degree of inherent unpredictability. So while we can talk confidently about some of the things we know, some of the things we can talk confidently about, some of the things we're uncertain about, we can't talk comfortably about the inherent unpredictability that is emerging. But we can do something about it. And that's what I want to end up with. The things you can do now to deal with the inherent unpredictability that is facing society now. Quick history. For me, this all started perhaps 45 years ago when I ran the first run of the model, oddly, when I was testing the results of work studying predation. Predation is a process, one of the major processes that ecosystems and populations encounter. And I had spent several years in an experimental program trying to develop a coherent theory of predation that would be able to capture everything from bacteria doing their thing to submarines doing their things in the full range. So in that full range, I've had one of the most dramatic, a student in East Africa studying attack strategies of lions, having his wife in a cage with a camera, and he with a camera in a jeep at an angle, so that they jointly record the moment when the lion came out of his hiding spot and began to run, and computed the speed of the lion, the speed of the gazelle, and the moment and distance at which the attack took place. And this was one little component. But the image of his wife in the cage on the plains of Africa, kept safe from the lions, was lived forever in my mind. The first run of this model surprised me. It surprised me because my mind was deeply rooted in an equilibrium view of the world. My ecology training was deeply rooted in equilibrium representation, Lotka-Voltaire equations and whatever. All of science, not all, I can't say that, but most of the science I knew about, and most of the social science, was similarly rooted in the notion there were equilibria. I don't mean necessarily a point. It might be a cyclic equilibrium, but that equilibrium was the key feature, and global stability. That is, you could be anywhere in the state space and forces will mobilize you to an equilibrium, was the dominant paradigm. This damn model, when I ran it, with the interaction between populations, using the results of all this experimental work for validation, suddenly, a surprise. And I thought there was a computer glitch. That is, you could start at some places in phase space, and indeed the system would evolve towards some sort of equilibrium state. But outside that space, it would go somewhere else. That is, it was the first demonstration to me of multi-equilibria states. And let me tell you, I just was stunned that it was so inconsistent with the training and the paradigm that I had been living on. And with the sudden emergence of this notion that it wasn't just the equilibrium conditions that were important, but the disequilibrium breakpoints that just shifted dramatically my ideas regarding, at that time, management of resources. The management of renewable resources had been dominated, and to some degree still is, by a command and control kind of approach. That is, you assume you have enough knowledge. You assume. You never do. But you assume you have enough knowledge to be able to define an equilibrium condition you would like in, say, fish populations like cod or anything else which collapsed. And you manage so as to achieve that equilibrium state. If you succeed, that's a guarantee, almost, that you will encounter an instability state, because the system itself will start to evolve, unseen by you. The diversity will change. And the instability domain around which your equilibrium state is surrounded will gradually shrink until the break point occurs, not because you've been unsuccessful, but because you've been apparently successful. And then the break point occurs and the organism flips up. Now I mentioned cod because basically that's what's happened to cod. With the addition, an inherent part of many of these systems, it has not recovered. And that's a critical thing in these multi-equilibrium states, is not only that there's more than one equilibrium, but when you flip from one to another, the forces that bring you back might no longer exist. So that was the original notion, and that was just as great fun. It was a totally different way to look at the world, and no one agreed with you. In fact, it took 20 years before people started to say grudgingly, well, maybe. And that maybe came because did that go off? Okay. Enough people began to demonstrate in nature the reality of those multi-stable states. I decided around this point that there was a need to expand the work and begin to see how other systems might behave. I assumed I did not have enough knowledge of other systems to be able to think coherently enough and accurately enough about them. And so I brought together a team of people who were sieved out of a series of workshops. And I'm going to mention a bit about them. Workshops in which one of the key features was the theme, which is roughly the theme we're talking about here. And we always met on islands. Now the reason we met on islands is because you're constrained. You can't go somewhere else. You can't go to the local pub or the bar or the strip joint or whatever. You have to stay on an island. And there on that island, there's an intense enough interchange. Typically, we would choose about 4 to 5 days. That out of it came the sieving of people. You could identify which people were brilliant and wonderful and great ideas. But then there was a subset of those who were the kind of people that not only worked hard and brilliantly, but also could play hard and have fun. And those are the ones we were trying to identify. Turns out it's about, I would say, 15% of a group would be of that character. So after we finished the workshop and did writing or whatever, we would take that 15% and be the seeds for the next workshop. So we built up a team of people who were brilliant as hell, enjoyed working together, played well together, wrote limericks. That was one of the tests. And they came from different disciplines. There was even a wonderful economist. I say that because economics was one of the ones I had the greatest difficulty in developing a healthy relationship with, except for this one man, a few others, of course, but that was Buzz Brock from the University of Wisconsin, well-known economist. But his basic feature was he was a nonlinear mathematician. And once you say that, you say here's someone that recognizes not just stability points, but instability conditions. And the work with him was just tremendous. He was the one who was deeply knowledgeable about the history of AT&T. Remember, it was broken up and then one and all spun off and so forth. And he had been a consultant during that period, and was the one who, and you'll see in the book Vanity, his piece in a box presentation, his analysis of AT&T from the perspective of this new view of instability, stability, and resilience that had come up. So there was Bud Brock, and there was sociologists and mathematicians and ecologists and so on. And we worked together for 5 years, maybe 3 workshops a year, roughly, of the whole group. 3 times where limericks were written and hard work was done. All over the world on islands. The people were ones who were interested in mutual discovery. That is, they each brought something special, but they were fascinated by seeing someone else's special idea and exploring how the 2 special ideas might link or contrast. So out of it came a very real synthesis that led to the notion and the recognition that there were these basic cycles in systems that were dealing with accumulated capital. The capital might be intellectual capital, it might be skills, it might be biomass, say in a forest, accumulation of capital. And that all these systems operated through in a metaphorical sense. They all operated in a sequence that started off with great entrepreneurial activity, great variety and diversity of activity, a very short time view, building up capital, gradual accumulation of that capital to the point where not only was capital accumulated, that is skills, knowledge, biomass, energy, whatever, but also accumulated, inevitably, were rigidities or ways of doing things, learned during the first phase of learning, which is incremental and procedural. And with that accumulation of rigidity was the gradual loss of resilience, that is, loss of the broad conditions in which the company or the society or the ecosystem could continue, to a narrower and narrower range. So in other words, each of these systems was growing to the point at its own time scale where it was very productive, but also increasingly vulnerable, increasingly sensitive to a break. The break might be something internal that's generated, or it might be external. or it might be a combination of the two. So in a forest, for example, the break might be called a forest fire, or the break might be called an insect outbreak. But the consequences is the breakdown of the accumulated resources that have been bound up in the functioning of that system. So the breakdown of the connections, the release of those accumulated resources, the loss and leakage of some of them, but in natural systems, quickly captured, so you'd have another shake of the dice. So another open system, now the result is very big, and then probabilistic events become extraordinarily important. The unpredictability, not only the uncertainty, the unpredictability gets very big. If the system has accumulated enough capital from previous cycles, the memory of the system, the accumulated litter and substrate of seeds and small plants, whatever, if that's been accumulated enough, then the throw of the dice is biased by what happened in the past, and you get a rough repeat of the same cycle. If, however, the destruction has been so great as to destroy some of that memory, then the repeat of the cycle can be any of a number of unpredictable things. And it's at that time where individual processes begin to dominate. It's at that time you can get unexpected synergies between elements that earlier were kept separate because of the structure. So it's a time of great uncertainty and unpredictability. It's the time when a cod can collapse and disappear, or a forest can shift from one state to an entirely different state, or when a business can collapse and emerge in another form entirely, or when a society, look at a very distant time, can equally collapse at the higher level, gradually losing its structure until the individual or the family is left as the only surviving entity. So it led us then to the key point that there's this linkage of phases in a cycle of growth, an inevitable rigidity and collapse, and then a time of great uncertainty and unpredictability. Okay. Added to that was the recognition that this happened at distinct scales, and in a true hierarchical way. That is, in a forest, there are the leaves doing their things on a centimeter scale monthly. There's the tree itself doing its thing on a multiple meter scale in decades. There's the forest stand, maybe in a boreal forest, for example, maybe 50 hectares, established by a particular past fire or insect outbreak, doing its things on century scale, and the forest itself, and so on. Distinct scales in which within a scale the interactions were tight, but between scales they were simple. And so long as those simple communications occurred between scales, from say the forest to the stand, to the trees, to the needles, so long as that communication back and forth was maintained, then the system would persist. So you could have an adaptive cycle including its creative destruction at one scale, and that need not percolate anywhere. It can occur, benefit from the higher order memory, and be reconstituted. But crises can occur. And in those crises, several pops.
Viennese water.
So as a consequence, you could see the interesting thing is not only could these systems persist by retaining these interactions without scale? But there were also traps. And at that time, when it was published in the book Panarchy, I think there were about 3 traps I mentioned. One of them I called a hierarchical trap. And the hierarchical trap that I was thinking of, please forgive me, but I was thinking of the Catholic Church. And I apologize to anyone who might be offensive. But here was a structure that over multiple centuries had retained a high degree of capital, a high degree of resilience, and a great degree of interconnectivity, because if there was anybody who was from inside that was trying to break it, all you had to do is legislate them out. So it was an inherently self-reinforcing entity that exists to this day, and carrying with it the most astonishing burden of dogmas and regulations that are, I mean, you just read about this and your mouth falls open. It's totally irrelevant, except to the people who are affected by Catholicism. You also get a poverty trap. That is, when resilience disappears or gets greatly reduced, the accumulated capital erodes away, and you're left with a system in which the scales have gradually collapsed. The higher level scales of the religion and the governments disappears, and the institutions disappear and collapse level by level till you're left with the individual or family scrambling on their own. So one can get from these systems not just stability and persistence, but in a cyclic kind of way. You can get also traps that systems can flip into. When I think of the Mayan civilizations, I think of them having flipped into a trap from which they were never extricated. There's something. So what's happening now? The beginning of this month, knowing this was coming up, I did my usual weekend thing, getting up at 6:30 in the morning. The sun is just rising off there. That's Vancouver. And I'm on Vancouver Island with a house on a cliff looking at it. Beautiful. There's an eagle flying by, and hummingbirds are coming to the hummingbird feeder. The smallest bird in the world, the rufous-backed hummingbird, and the biggest bird in that region, the eagle. That somehow encompasses. And then the Douglas fir forest sliding down to the Gulf of Georgia, and then the Gulf of Georgia and Vancouver with salmon swimming there. And I sit and read newspapers. I open up the computer and I pick New York Times, usual thing, The Economist, in Canada, the Globe and Mail. And I simply started to list the sort of world-scale issues and crises that were dominantly in our system now. I just listed them, and there they are there. That's just from one morning reading. And there's some of the things we mentioned. The Louisiana oil spill, past peak oil, further and further, harder and harder. You know, mistakes are going to happen. You're going to have more of those things. That particular thing is destroying a good part of the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, and maybe even creeping around through the loop of current through the islands up on the west coast as well. We don't know. There's a notice that there's going to be a pipeline built to Kitimat. That doesn't mean anything to you guys. But it's a pipeline from the oil sand. The filthiest method of extracting, hard to extract oil in the world. It's just extraordinarily filthy. We need to sell this stuff. Americans are increasingly, in Greenpeace, making it difficult to sell it south. So they want to sell it to China. Now there's a mountain in the way. And so you have to get it from Alberta through the mountain to the west coast. They choose Kitimat. Kitimat is at the end of the most beautiful fjord. There are two major Aboriginal communities who have become very sophisticated and politically and socially skillful, and also artistically skillful. They say, I don't care if they try, we're going to blockade. We will start a war. They're now called First Nations. They have a lot of independence. To move oil in that way, to ship it, is just a mixture of the arrogance and the stupidity of a system that has gotten into its rigid, overly rigid state. A third of the honeybee colonies in North America, at least, have collapsed this winter. A third. No one knows totally why, but they're part of the pollination of a major market crop production. The financial collapse, we all know about that. The U.S. healthcare system, an incredibly bizarre series of negotiations that groaningly pushed out any government involvement and came up with a system that in 4 years would have 90% plus of the population served. The U.S. Supreme Court removing controls on lobbyists. So any amount of money can be spent on a political lobbying. I mean, that's amazing. Goldman Sachs wins and loses. It's legal, but it's totally immoral. The Greek debt and the euro. And it just keeps on going. Haiti is a poverty trap with the volcano. Forest companies now have become, thankfully, too big to succeed. They got so big they had to mine their forests in order to pay the bills. Small companies, different and not bad. Arizona and the new immigration law. It just goes on and on. Ice melting in the Arctic. Now that's interesting. I spent this summer 3 weeks on the Louis Saint Laurent, which is the biggest Canadian icebreaker, as part of the scientific group advising on a program. And there you can see from satellite imagery something like 1/3 of the ice has disappeared, the surface ice has disappeared in the last 10 years. The warming trend is just transparent, the obvious. The Beaufort Sea has become much less salty. Currents have shifted. Some species of plankton have shown tendencies to flip. It's a system in transformation now. Climate change skepticism is interesting. In the United States, only 20-some% of the people believe there's such a thing as climate change. The rest are convinced it's a hoax. That's fascinating. Anyway, all these things are indicative of a stage of a system that has accumulated the rigidities and resistances, and it's a state ready to change. So it's in a state of creative destruction. Now what happens then? First thing, all the powers that have accumulated their power over the last 30, 40, 50, 60, so on years, begin to exert their influence to prevent any change, to stop any transition to a new system. And they're effective and powerful, and we see them. All the skepticism in Europe about the University of Sussex emails, remember those? All that is created by a lobbying group that does not want change to occur. And it's powerful, and it's effective. So you see that emergence of the power. You will also see the emergence of the alternative to that power, which is also, you don't see it too obviously because they're all small scale. You see a lot in the internet business and communication business where it's more obvious, but you see it elsewhere as well. And by these I'm referring to those experiments that are occurring, always occur at a time of creative destruction. Small groups at that time have the greatest influence. They have very little influence early in the cycle when the dominant systems are accumulating their capital. But when a break occurs, they're the ones that do this synergistic inventions, and then synergistic interactions between them occur to set the seeds for the next cycle. That's where we're at now. But it's unpredictable. Not uncertain, there's that too, but inherently unpredictable. You don't know which are going to work and which aren't. Some you know will fail, but some will succeed. The ones you'd like to see now, in the present state of the world, have the unique feature of ideally crossing scales. Now, as I've been talking about some things that are local, but I've also been talking at the scale of the whole planet when we talk about climate change. I've been talking about hierarchical, panarchical levels. And the kind of experiments one would like to see now are ones that would test various aspects across those scales. From Vienna, if you want, to the whole planet. Now, we have a wonderful organization that we embedded, I think it was 12 years ago, called the Viennese Alliance. It was embedded to try to get around the complexity of getting grants. You were referring here to how little money was left over in discretionary money for support. Well, at that time, I said, I'm sick and tired of this grant. I have to get grants, but it would be nice to make an organization that lived without grants. So we embedded this organization, drawing from the people who were good on islands. 19 groups, representing 19 groups around the world, from South Africa to the UK, to France, to England, to Canada, to the US, a wonderful group in Sweden, various groups around the world, each of which would provide a membership. At that time, it was very modest, I thought, of $7,000. So each group was asked, could you produce $7,000? We pool that $7,000 and have $150,000 to $200,000. And that establishes the first biologically based internet journal. Pure internet, no paper. Pure internet. Now, at that time, 12 years ago, people said, that's ridiculous. That won't work in the developing world because they won't have the equipment. Aha, not so. They say this is the best thing that's happened to us because now, although the power goes off, the electrical lines drop, it comes back and we can get back on. Whereas paper, when you lose paper, it never returns. So it became very popular in the third world as well as the other world. We changed its name to ecology in society because the emphasis was on integrated understandings. And its aim was not policy, but the knowledge that is accumulated as a foundation for policy. And so it represented various systems. And it's been wonderful. It's worked very, very well. And there's various conventions in that journal that have done wonders. So there we were. We had the Resilience Alliance, we had the journal, and we began a series of work and discussions and meetings, this and the other. And we produced a book, Panarchy. When I go back to I think I started 2 years ago at the meeting in Sweden to the Resilience Alliance folks, and I said, look, let's identify and establish a series of experiments made in the world across scales. What suggestions do you have? The first thing that came up, it was extremely hard. You can think of within a scale experiments, a lot of those. No, we wanted ones that actually cross scales. it was very, 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 very hard for people to think of good ones, which in itself is important. These aren't easy to think of. There were some. There was one involving Northern Europe, and that the forest conditions in Northern Europe have been the species diversity in those forests has been very seriously compromised because of forest fires. With climate change occurring, there opens the opportunity of natural invasions from the south into those forests to potentially reestablish the diversity. And one of the experiments was to imagine communities along the way becoming part of a scheme to open corridors up for the movements of those organisms over the next 30 years. Another one was the salmon on the west coast are dramatically dropping in number. 2 of the 5 species are dropping dramatically. And some of those are moving north as waters warm. And spawning is actually occurring in the Mackenzie River, which is a very rare thing. So the thought was, well, let's shift all the attention up to preserving those spawning beds in the northern rivers. But then a third one, and that's the one I want to complete my remarks about today. And it's called the mosquito fleet. You know, mosquito derms. Mosquito fleet, meaning boats. This started in the Arctic on this icebreaker I mentioned. Those folks, as part of a Canadian program called 3 Canadian Oceans, each year have an icebreaker from the west and the east start north and interchange at the top of the planet. And they have a particular path they take, and they do the standard oceanographic measurements, plankton, temperature, acidity, current speed, turbidity, the whole plankton composition, visual observation of polar bears and seals and the whole bit each year. And it's called the 3 oceans, 3 Canadian oceans: North Atlantic, North Pacific, and the Arctic. Okay. Eddie Carmack, a Canadian, is in charge of it. And he is a quiet genius. And he does things that are amazing. He will talk the government into establishing a discussion group, a philosophers group on board to talk with the scientists. And last year I was one of the 7 members of that philosophers group. And we talked about everything. Economics, and politics, and political affairs between nations, 7 nations in the top. And out of it came the idea that the real understanding of climate change over the top of the planet can only become if you have this large-scale monitoring combined with local investigations and monitoring in local communities at the mouths of rivers. All the west coast, along the ice ridge in the Arctic, and into the Northern Atlantic. That the scales are such that the phenomena occurring between those scales, the local scale, and the big scale, goes through several flips. There's about 3 scales in between. And the notion came up, how could we set up an experiment that would connect all those scales in a way that would allow the people working at each scale to interact with the people at other scales? So how, in effect, do you get the Aboriginals on the west coast of British Columbia, on the various river systems, doing work, monitoring, and then interacting with the scientists, say, in the Arctic icebreaker stuff? So what we've done is set in motion such an experiment, and it's based upon a proposal we sent to the McDonnell Foundation, which has a campaign, has a grants. I said I didn't get out of grants, but I'm back in a grants program called the Complexity Program. And this would be should be nuclear grist risk for their mill. But we won't know until June or July whether it goes forward. But anyway, there's the proposal. And what we have as a start is a network of Arctic investigations through something called the Pioneer Program. Pioneers are members of the Canadian military, adjunct military. These are Inuit and Dene, who are all completely familiar with the ice and the waters and blah, blah, blah. And they go up regularly and do samples of the edge of the ice. We have 6 communities on the west coast, and we'll have one vessel from each, one working vessel, typically used for fishing, but also used for communication. One vessel, by vessel I mean a small trawler. And each of those trawlers in each of those villages will be outfitted with scaled-down sampling devices of the kind that will end up sampling the same thing as the bigger systems sampled in the Arctic. And a schedule of movement of those vessels will be planned for each community, and they will be paid for the accumulation of the data and the transmission of that data to a website, which then becomes a part of the vehicle of interaction and communication. The first examples, if we get the grant, will start this summer. And Eddie Carmack, and I'll go on for some of it, will get on a particular big sailing vessel, and they'll go from community and community and community, interacting with and developing that fleet. And that will be what I'll be spending the rest of my life on, that experiment. And that's all that I'll be interested in, that experiment. And the communication with the people and among the people, from the Aborigines through to the science. It's that kind of experiment, I think, of which that's just one, that we need now to encourage. Sure, we can get frustrated by the lobbyists and the power. I don't give a damn. I really don't. They're irrelevant. They're irrelevant, my friend. Don't worry about them. Do something positive through a new experiment. Thank you very much.